All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. Let's begin with our sponsorships. A moment or two early. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for Tafshin Pei Hey, our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilson Mishpacha, Meir for sponsoring all the Shimon drushos this year as a zechus for besuros, tovos, Am Yisroel. Our week of learning sponsors, Rabbi Aryeh Chana Richter, in memory of Rabbi Richter's dear grandmother, Sarah Bas Shimon, Zichron Livracha. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Jacob and Julie Blumenfeld, Le'ilui Nishmas, Captain Eyal, Mevorach, Twito, Hashem Yikom Damo, who gave his life fighting for Am Yisroel and Eretz Yisrael's Yartsite is today. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today as well, Saeed and Sima Haken, Le'ilui Nishmas Saeed's mother, TAJI Bas Harav Meir Moshe, on the occasion of our first Yartsite. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Nishmas and Aliyah, the families in the Chama, bring all of our hostages home, and our holy soldiers should be successful. B'chol Maaseh Yedehim. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. An ambitious day ahead of us, but we're going to make it. So today's daf is Mem Ches 48, but we are picking up on Mem Zayin Amud Beis 47b, and we are picking up at Rav Ashi Amar. Rav Ashi says as follows: Avelos me'emasai kamascheles. When does Avelos begin? So remember again, the Gemara was talking about the concept of hol v'id. We ran out of time yesterday, but we didn't quite finish up the sugya. Gemara was talking about the sugya of hol v'idchu. The concept of that sometimes once something is set aside and cannot be performed, so at the end of the day, it can't be performed any longer afterwards as well. So the Gemara says as follows: When does Avelos begin? Right, at what point in time does Avelos begin? So the Gemara says, Nishmas Saeed. So again, Avelos technically begins from the time that the grave is filled in. So the Gemara says, Kapara me'emasai kahavya. When does Kapara begin? Because remember again, we saw in yesterday's daf that there are three elements to Kapara through death. Part one is death itself, part two is burial, and then part three is decomposition. So the Gemara says, okay, Avelos begins from the time that the grave is filled in. When does Kapara begin? Mihichazu tsara de kivra porta. So literally translated, from the moment that the pain of the grave begins. Which again, bepashtos means the beginning of decomposition. So we'll say, so what's the issue? So remember again, the Mishnah pointed out that when someone is killed through Amisas Beis Din, there's no shiva. There's no shiva, there's no avelos. So again, because what's interesting over here, in other words, a person would want to sit shiva for their relative. The problem is they can only sit shiva when after kapara begins. When does kapara begin? The beginning of decomposition. But when does avelos begin? Time that the grave is filled in. So the problem is, at the time that avelos begins, at the time that shiva would have begun, you can't sit shiva because the executed individual has not yet achieved their kapara. So therefore the Mishnah rules, no shiva. What do you see from here? Hilcha, hol v'idchu. So we'll say, what you see from here is that Allah Chalamaysa again, that once something has been nidcha, once something can't be performed, then ultimately, again, it is forever precluded from performance. If that's the case, so we'll say, now here's what's interesting. In yesterday's daf, it sounded like that kapara only occurs with actual decomposition. But now what we see from here, that it's not complete decomposition. Even some decomposition is fine. If that's the case, why do you need complete decomposition to move the body? Remember, again, the Mishnah said that Allah Chalamaysa, we go ahead and we move the body to kever avos after it's fully decomposed. But why do you need complete decomposition? After all, again, just let it be even partial decomposition. That should be enough. To which the Gemara says, Mishum D'lo Efshar. That's actually a logistical issue. Well, Rabbi say, once a body begins to decompose, you can't really move it. You can't move it because it falls apart. So therefore, either it has to be disinterred when the body is complete, or you wait for complete decomposition. If you wait for complete decomposition, then you could go and move the bones afterwards. Okay, so we'll say, so again, just another proof to the concept of hol v'nitchu, nitchu. Once something is set aside, it's set aside. Good. So we'll say another interesting sugi over here. Kivri derav havashakli mini afra lashisa bas yoma. So this is very interesting. So apparently, I would say one of the Talmudic remedies for treating a fever treating a fever, a first day fever, is earth, is dirt. So they used to take dirt from the kever of Rav to treat a first day fever. Okay? Now, I will say now, it sounds like over here, if you look at Rashi says over here, Lashisa bas yoma biyom rishon shala vehin misrapin ba'osa offer. So again, I don't know if it's dafka like grave dirt or just dirt in general. But apparently, again, this dirt has a medicinal quality, and therefore it'd be very good for a first day fever. So the Gemara says they would take it from the kever of Rav. Take it from the kever of Rav. So the Gemara says, Am Yisroel. So people came to Shmuel to complain about this because they thought it was inappropriate. How could it be that you're taking dirt from the kever of Rav to go ahead and treat a fever? Seems like a misappropriation of something dedicated to the dead. So they came to Shmuel and said, Amr Yehus Abdon. Shmuel said, Shkoyach. Shmuel said, I think it's a great idea. Why? The Gemara says, Karka olam hu v'karka olam ina ne'eseres. So Shmuel said, it's karka olam, it's earth. And earth is never prohibited. Now, what's his raya? D'chsiv vayashlech es afra al kever b'nei ha'am. So we'll say Yoshio, one of the kings, when he wanted to repudiate the avodah zarah, he ground up all of the avodah zarah and he sprinkled the avodah zarah dust on the kvarim of the people. So the Gemara says, "Makish kever b'nei ha'am la'avodas kochavim." So the Navi is comparing the kvarim to avodah zarah. Ma avodas kochavim memuchaber lo misra. Listen, it's very interesting. Avodah zarah cannot be chal on something that is mechuber lekarka, something that is attached. The ground or attached to the ground. For example, the Gemara says, "D'chsev asher tem yarshim osam es Eloheim al haharim haramim." So interestingly enough, so the pasuk here talks about the idea. In Devarim, when we go into Eretz Yisrael, we have to eradicate all vestiges of Avodah Zarah. So the Torah speaks about, again, the nations that you inherit, right? Asher Yarshim Osam Es Eloheim Al Haharim. So their gods are positioned on the mountains. So the Gemara Darshans over here, the Gemara says, Al Haharim Eloheim Velo Haharim Eloheim. It's an interesting halacha. It's dafka their gods on the mountains and not their gods which are the mountains. In other words, let's say somebody decides to say, you know what, I hereby declare 7 Mile Lane as an avodah zarah. Right? It's an avodah zarah. Right? This mountain is an avodah zarah. You can't do that. Avodah zarah identity does not devolve upon karka. Right? See, avodah zarah identity devolves upon objects. So the Gemara wants to suggest over here, so therefore you can't make a mountain avodah zarah. You can't make a street avodah zarah. So the pasuk compares avodah zarah to a kever, to a grave. So the same way that halacha l'maisa, avodah zarah, can't devolve upon karka, so too again the prohibitions of a grave can't devolve upon karka as well. So the Gemara says, so therefore again, that's why Rav said, or Shmuel said it's not a problem that they're taking earth from Rav's grave in order to go ahead and treat a first day fever. So basically, Meir is the kasha, interesting case. So let's say Reuven lost his father, right? Reuven's father Yaakov died. So what did Reuven do? He dug a grave for his father, but it turns out that he ended up using a different grave for his father. So he dug grave A for his father, but buried his father in grave B. So Gemara says, Harizel lo yikbar bo olamis. So again, Reuven should not bury. So in other words, that grave that Reuven originally dug for his father can't be used at all. So we'll say that sounds like, that's again, we're going to further qualify this ruling later on, but that sounds like halacha l'maisa. That earth does become prohibited. So Shimon says, no, No, that's talking about where Reuven actually built a structure on top of the ground for his father. In other words, burial might have been in the ground, but he built a structure on top. It's that structure that becomes prohibited for non-use. That will say now, why exactly it becomes prohibited for non-use, we'll have to see. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, first, Lo yikbar haben olam estechevan de huzman lemeis ne'esar b'chol hana. V'chsad dahua din nami im chatzvu l'tzorech ish acher v'archa de milsonaket. Now, the Gemara is assuming over here that this case is not specific in that Reuven dug it for his father. It would have been halacha with anyone. Once you dig a grave for someone, so there's a lot of things happening in this case which are going to unravel in just a little bit, but the idea for us in this moment is that halacha l'maisa, ground does become prohibited. To which the Gemara says, no, we're not talking about ground. What are we talking about? An above ground structure. that becomes prohibited. Okay, Tashma, kever chadash muter ba'ano. So we'll say a brand new kever. Now, what's a brand new kever? Bepashtos, the kever that wasn't designated for anyone. Rashi says over here, "V'lo lemeis hozman elachatz v'stam or lechashiyam oslam meisik berenu." So we'll say stam, a grave was dug, not for anyone in particular. So it's muter ba'ano. Muter ba'ano. Be interesting to see how to repurpose that, right? But lamaisa again, it's muter ba'ano. Okay, so the Gemara says hitel bo nefel, but if you put now nefel, we'll say is usually like a miscarriage or a stillborn. So you go ahead and you bury a baby in that asr ba'ano. Ultimately, again, it becomes asr ba'ano. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that once you use a grave for the dead, the earth itself becomes prohibited from any benefit. To which the Gemara says, no, hachanami bekever binyan. Once again, what are we talking about over here? An above ground structure. Above ground structure. Okay. So Tashma, Nimtza Ata Omer Shalosh Kvarasim. So this is very interesting. So the Gemara says, in reality, in the world of graves, there are three different types of graves. What are they? Kever HaNimtza. Kever HaNimtza means, I will say, that you discover a kever in your property. Right? In other words, you discover that somebody buried. Now, again, what that means is somebody illegally buried their dead in your property. It happens, right? So Lamaisa, that's called Kever HaNimtza. That's category one. Category two is kever hayadua, which, as it's understood, it's a kever on your property, but you knew about it. And number three is kever hamazik es harabim, a kever which poses a not danger, but damage to the public. Now, both say, how does a kever pose damage to the public? So Rashi points out over here that, for example, the kever is situated in a public thoroughfare, and halacha l'maisa, people are passing over it with their truma, with their meiser, with other items that then become ritually impure as a result of the location of the kever. So we'll say, what's the halacha with all three of these? Kever and imsa. So we'll say, if you find a grave on your property, which means somebody illegally buried their dead on my property, then what's halacha? I'm allowed to move the kever. I'm allowed to move it. Pino, and once you move it, mekomo tahar. So ultimately, again, the area in which the dead was buried is tahar, and muter ba'ano. And that's because that was an illegal burial. Somebody was not allowed to put their dead there. They did. I'm allowed to move it. I'm allowed to use it, and the area is tahar. Kever hayadua. If you have, again, a kever that was known, which means, again, I knew that somebody buried their dead on my property, asu lifnoso, you're not allowed to move it. Pino mekomo tamei, if you go ahead and you move it, the makom is tamei. Vashabana, you can't get handa. And I say that's the power we're focusing on over here. The idea over here is you see that halacha l'maisa, the karka does remain tamei, or I should say asr ba'ano. Kavra mazik esarabim, if there's a kever that does damage or poses damage to the general public, then halacha is mutar l'fno, so you're allowed to move it. Pino, and if you do move it, mekomo tahar, its area is tahar, but asr ba'ano. So we'll say, so once again, you see a thing in 2 out of the 3 cases, right, that halacha l'maisa, the area itself of the grave is asr ba'ano. To which the Gemara says, once again, hachanami bekever binyan. Talking about over here, about a structure built on top of the grave. The Gemara says, okay, the kever nimso mutar l'fnoso. Now, by the way, the Gemara says, by the way, just as an aside, if you find a grave on your property, you're just allowed to move it. What about the following situation? Dilma meis mitzvahu or meis mitzvah chanamakomo. Maybe it's a meis mitzvah, right? Maybe, again, you're right, somebody buried the dead on my property. You know why? Because somebody was found dead on my property. And what's the halacha? We'll say, where do you bury a meis mitzvah? Right where you find him. And he acquires that area. So why are we so quick to say that you're allowed to move it? Maybe this is a meis mitzvah which cannot be moved. To which the Gemara says, no, shiny meis mitzvah, the kala islay. A meis mitzvah is different. Why is a meis mitzvah different? Because it has a kol. It has a kol. In other words, people know about a meis mitzvah. All right, itmar. So I'll say, so again, so I just want to point out over here what's occurred. What's occurred is that halacha l'maisa, the dirt of a kever itself is not necessarily asr ba'ano. And that's why Shmuel paskin that halacha l'maisa, they could take the dirt from the kever of Rav to treat a one-day fever. So it sounds like that's what the Gemara is saying over here. The only time it becomes asr is when you have some, because now why wouldn't the dirt of a kever be asr ba'ano? Because of the comparison between a grave and avodah zarah. just like avodah zara, anything that is karka, mechuber lekarka, ultimately is not asur ba'ana. So too by a grave, the karka itself is not asur ba'ana. Conversely, a binyan, a structure built on top of a grave, that will be asur ba'ana. Okay, so we'll say, so now a very interesting sugya. Itmar, ha'orig beged l'meis. We'll say this is fascinating. And this sugya has a lot of different ramifications. So, ha'orig beged l'meis. So what happens? Somebody makes a garment for the deceased. Right? So again, we'll call it Yaakov died, and Reuven goes ahead and weaves a beged for so do me a favor, just take it. No, only because I could see a little bit. Good, perfect. All right, let's say don't be sorry. I feel bad because I don't have a shalom aleichem back there. So the Gemara says follows. So itmar ha'orig beged l'meis. So now watch this. Somebody went ahead and made tachrichim shrouds. Okay, now interestingly enough, watch what's happened over here. So we'll say, so the shaila is, well, actually, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, ha'orei beged l'meis, la'achar shemes. So we'll say, so now, Yaakov died. Reuven made tachrichim for Yaakov. He made shrouds. So we'll say, so now the shaila is, what is the status of the shroud? So Abaye Amar Asar. Abaye says it's asr. Now, what does that mean, asr? Rava says it's mutter. So what this means is like this. Abaye says, you cannot use that shroud now for something else. Rava says, yes, you can. So Abaye Amar Asr. Abaye says it's asr hazmana milsihi. Abaye says, designated something for a particular use, endows it with that identity. So therefore, once you go ahead and you make a shroud for burial, that becomes a burial shroud, even if it has not actively been used in that way, and therefore halacha l'maaseh becomes asr ba'ana. Just like any other accessories of the dead become asr ba'ana. Okay, Rava Amar Mutter. Rava says, no, it's mutter. Why? Hazman alav milsihi. Rava says designation does not endow an item with identity. Right? So again, Rava says, when does the shroud become asr ba'ana? When does it become asr ba'ana? When you wrap the mace in it. That's when it becomes asr ba'ana. So we'll say, this is a yisodistic machlokes that we're going to see really extends in many different areas of halacha. Hazmana milsi, hazmana lav milsi. Does designation endow the item with identity or not? Machlokes Abaye and Rava. Okay, so let's analyze this. So my time with Abaye, Abaye who says that hazmana milsihi, that designation endows with identity. What's his logic? My time with Abaye, Gamar sham me egla arufa. So interesting enough, Abaye makes a gzera shava of sham from egla arufa. So we'll say, so just to get the psukim, Torah talks about vatamas sham Miriam, vatikaver sham. And then that's lashon of sham by Misa, by death of Miriam. And by egla arufa it's va'arfu sham es ha'egla. They will decapitate the calf there. So sham. So sham by death, sham by egla arufa. So it says ma egla arufa ba'azmana misira, by egla arufa, the moment you designate it. Now the truth is, it's not really the moment you designate it. Rashi points out over here, it's the moment you bring it into the dry riverbed, right? So once you bring it into the dry riverbed, that's the designation. From that moment on, it is designated as egla arufa, and from that moment on, it is asr ba'ana. So hainami b'hazmana misra. Okay, so just like egla arufa, the moment you designate it, it is asr ba'ana. So too again, by death, by tachrichim, any we'll call it, any death accessories are automatically asr ba'ana from the moment you designate it. Rava Amar, sham me avodas kochavim. So Rava has a different gzera shava of sham to avodah zara. Ma avodas kochavim ba'azman lo misra. I will say something very interesting about avodah zara. Avodah zara does not become asr by designation, only through worship. For example, let's say I say this table is going to be avodah zara. Table avodah zara. Let's keep it simple, right? So the designation of the table as avodah zara does not make it avodah zara. There has to be an act of worship. I could bow down to it. I could offer a libation to it, put a carbon on it, right? But designation itself does not create avodah zara. So therefore, Rav says just like ma'avodas chacham b'hazman lo misra, av hachanami, so too by death accessories b'hazman lo misra. Incredible. So we'll say so. Really, literally two different gzera shavas. Fascinating. The Rava, my time will go me egla rufa. So Rava, why don't you learn? So Rava, why don't you learn it out from Egla Rufa? So the Gemara says, Amar Lecha, Mishamshin Gaminon, Lafukle Egla Rufa Dihi Gufa Kidusha. Because we will say it is better to learn out Avodah Zarah accessories from Tachrichim. Because we also remember again, both of them are accessories. Both of them are accessories. As opposed to Egla Rufa, which is the Ikar Avoda itself. Top of Memches, second line, Va'abaye, Mai Taima Garme Avodas Chacham. Abaye, why do you learn it out from Avodah Zarah? Emar Lecha, Midi de Arche, Midi de Arche. Garminus. Abaye says, we should learn common things out from common things. In other words, what are two common things? Death and Avodah Zarah. Let's throw in taxes also, right? But Lamaisa again, death and Avodah Zarah, that's common. The Gemara says, Egla Fuke Avodos. I'm sorry. Why doesn't that? Sorry, she said that wrong. Why doesn't that Baye learn it out from Avodos Kochavim? Amar Lecha Midi de Arche Midi de Arche Gaminon. We learn out common things from common things. What's common? Egla Rufa and death. La Fuke Avodos Kochavim de Lav Archa. To exclude Avodah Zarah, which is not normal. Interestingly enough, sometimes this statement historically was a little bit more aspirational than actual. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Midi di arche shederech haYehudim lasos kain. It's the derech of Jews to die and to bring an egla arufa. He says, Aval Avodah Zarah asura la'avod al livnei noach hilchach lo mitzra tashmish tidei. So again, the point that Abai is making over here is, let's compare things that truly exist within the orbit of the Yid. So what exists within the orbit of the Yid? So death, because again, that's part of the human condition. And Egla Rufa. But Avodah Zarah is something that is usher to us. Why bring that up as part of the limud? Okay, so we'll say, so now we're not finished with this. But we've just set the table for a raging machlokes. What's the machlokes? Hazmana milsa, lav milsa. Does designation of an item endow it with its intended identity or not? Abaye says, yes, Hazmana Milsa. Rava says, no, Hazmana Lav Milsa. So now let's dig into this sugya. Here we go. Meisvei, Samare Zekasha, Kipa, Shutame Medris. So listen to this. Let's say you have a scarf. A scarf, Kipa is usually like a woman's scarf. Shitame Medris. That is ultimately, again, is Tame Tumas Medris. Take a look at Rashi. Sha'af hu ra'i lemedris, pamim shemekafalto v'yosheves halav, onish enes rosh halas. Remember again, what's Tumas Medris? Tumas Medris is any time that, let's say, for example, a zav will sit on something or rest his weight on something, or hers, or zav or zava. Ultimately, again, it could convey what's called Tumas Medris to the item. So a shawl, or like a kerchief could be makabel Tumas Medris, because again, a person could put their head on it, a person could sit on it. So that, let's say you have a kippah shutami Medris, v'nasnu l'sefer. The lesson is very interesting. And what happens? You took this shawl, this tzif, and you designated it as a Sefer Torah cover. Okay, so now interestingly enough, as a Sefer Torah cover, obviously no one's going to sit on it. Right? No one's going to sit on it. No one's going to rest their weight on it. What's the halacha? Tar min ha-medris, aval tami maga. So ultimately, again, it is now tahar from Tumas Medris, right? Because ultimately, again, Rashi points out, even without tvila, even without immersion, it's going to be tahar from Tumas, because no one's going to lean on it or sit on it, because it is designated for Sefer Torah use. But it can still contract Tumah from Tumas Maga. So I'll say, so what do you see from here? Now, the way we're reading this Gemara is, you've designated it for use as a Sefer Torah, as a cover for a Sefer Torah. I haven't actually used it, I've designated it. And yet, it says, it's tar from Tumas Medris. What does that show you? That Hazmana Milsihi, that designation endows the item with its intended identity. To which the Gemara says, no, Ema nasnasa v'karachto. No. What it means is, you actually gave it to the Sefer Torah and used it to wrap the Sefer Torah. This is not Hazmana. This is not designation. What is this? This is active use already. To which the Gemara says, nasnata v'karachto. Rav Chisda, Hi sudra da azmane lemeitza by tefillin. So we'll say, listen to this. So the Gemara says, 1 second. If you actually used it to wrap a Sefer Torah, so what's the conversation over here? That's obvious. Tujar says, no. There is another plot twist in this. Watch this. Rav Chisda. This is fascinating. We're going to come visit this later on again. What did Rav Chisda do? Rav Chisda. Hi sudra da azmane lemeitza by tefillin. Listen to this. We'll say, if you have once again a shawl, and you're using this as, you designated it as a tefillin bag. I'm going to wrap my tefillin in this shawl. V'tzar be tefillin, and I used it for tefillin. Asra l'meitzar be pshiti. You're not allowed to use it as a money bag. In other words, once I've used it for tefillin, I can't use it as a money bag. So the Gemara says, Azmane v'lo tsarbe v'lo azmane. But if I went ahead and designated it but didn't use it, or used it but didn't designate it, shari l'meitzar be pshiti. You could use it as a money bag. So we'll say, this is the fascinating position of Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says, in order to endow an item with identity, you need 2 things. Number 1, hazmana, right, designation, and use. If you don't have designation and use, the item does not have its identity, which is actually quite fascinating. So it's going to turn out, by the way, that there's really 3 opinions in this whole thing. There's Abaye, Rava, and Rav Chisda. Abaye says hazmana and also designation endows identity. Rava says Hazmana la milsa, designation does not endow identity. And Rav Chisda says you need hazmana and shimush. You need designation and use in order to endow an item with identity. Pretty incredible. Okay, Abaye the Amar hazmana milsa. According to Abaye, who says that designation endows with identity, I'm going to stop translating it. So you understand hazmana milsa. That's what just going to. So Abaye Amar hazmana milsa. Azmane afagav dol tzarbe. According to Abaye, who says that designation is significant, so now Allah as soon as you designated that shawl for tefillin, even if you did not use it, it still has its identity. Sarbe, but what happens if you used it? I azmene in, I lo. Now, boss, here's what's interesting. Abaye says, in order to endow with identity, you need designation. Now, designation without use is enough, but use without designation, according to Abaye, does not endow with identity. So the Gemara goes weiter. Tashma. So let's still try to figure out who's correct in this machlokes. So Tashma. Nefesh shebeno l'shem chai muter ba'ana. Interesting case. So we'll say so a nefesh. Now what is a nefesh? A nefesh essentially is like a memorial, a grave, a tomb. So interestingly enough, you built a nefesh l'shem chai. Right? In other words, you built a tomb for someone who's alive. I don't know, birthday present, anniversary present, whatever it is, right? So the Maisa, some people just are not creative, right? So the Maisa, you built, in other words, somebody who's obviously going to imminently die, you go ahead and essentially you construct it while they're still alive. So what's halacha? Muter ba'ana. This is muter ba'ana, right? Because again, it's built for a living person. So because it's built for a living person, therefore it does not take on the identity as anything for the dead. If you look at Rashi says, Nefesh, binyan she'al ha'kever, shebeno l'shem chai, l'chishiyamos yikaver bo. So again, this is an above ground structure that is built on top of a grave, that when somebody dies, they're going to be buried there. So again, so l'shem meis aser. Interestingly enough, if you built it for someone who's already dead, then it is aser ba'ana. Right? Aser ba'ana. So I'll say, what does that sound like? Now, it sounds like you're building it for a person who's already dead, but what they have not yet been buried there, which sounds like what's happening over here. There's hazmana, there's designation, and yet it says it's aser ba'ana, which sounds like, again, hazmana milsi, like Abaye, to which the Gemara says, no, hachama haskinon terama bemes. No, we're talking about where somebody was buried there already. The Gemara says, okay, ihaki ma'irya, Yaki might hear Yahosif. So I'll say if that's the case, then why do we even have to mention anything about adding on any additional layers? Kila Hosif Namilo. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, even if you don't go ahead and add on anything, it's still going to be Asr Ba'ana, to which the Gemara says, Hosif Nami, Lotzricha Avagav de Panye. So I'll say this is interesting. The Gemara says, no, the structure remains Asr even if you move the deceased, even if you move the corpse out of it and rebury it somewhere else. So the Gemara says, Amaraf from Bar Papa Amrav Chisda, Imhaya Makiro Chalsasa Mutter. If you know the exact area that was added on after the person died, you could remove that and the structure remains mutter. Tashma. Okay, so let's say Chotzev Kever La'aviv, V'halach V'kivra V'kivrachas. Let's say we're still in this machlokes. So listen to this case. Yaakov died. His son Ruvain goes ahead and chotzev kever l'aviv, digs a grave for his father. By the lashon of chotzev is with stones, right? He moves aside stones in order to go ahead and make a kever for his father. V'halach v'kavra b'kever acher, and then Ruvain ends up burying his father in a different grave. Okay, so obviously we'll say what's the shaila? Shaila is what's the status of the first grave which was dug? Harei zeh lo yikaber ba'olamis. Ultimately, again, Ruvain can't use the first grave forever. So the Gemara says, Moshe, so again, why is the Gemara bringing this up? What does this sound like? This sounds like this is a din of Hazmana Milsa. Hazmana Milsa, the grave has been designated, therefore it can't be used. So the Gemara says, no. Hashem Mishum Kavod Aviv. No, it's actually nothing to do with Hazmana. It's a din in Kibud Av. A din in Kibud Av, honor of father. So because he dug the grave for his father, therefore Allah say he can't use it forever. That's covered for his father. Somebody moved the side stones to create a grave for his father, and he ended up burying his father somewhere else. You should never use the grave at all. Forever. So if you say that this is a din in Kibud Av, then fine. I will say, but ultimately, again, if it's a din of Hazmana, Tavi la'ariga mi'ika l'man damar. So I will say, it's interesting. Again, just like even with shrouds themselves, when you're beginning to weave the shrouds together, does anyone say that that's Hazmana Milsa? Hazmana Milsa at most is what? When the shroud itself is completed. So too over here, this lashon of achot sev kever, which means like you're moving aside stones. So the moment you begin to move aside stones, halacha l'maisa, again, that's it, the grave is prohibited forever. It doesn't make any sense. Rather, but what you have to say is that this case is a separate din by Kibud Av. So it turns out, it's already the second time we mentioned this case. So it turns out that if a person digs a grave for their parent and ends up burying the parent in a different grave, that first grave becomes Asr Ba'ana for the digger, for the child. Why? It's not a din in Hazmana. What is it? It's a din in Kibud Av'aim. A din in honoring your parents. That a grave that was dug for a parent should not be used for anything else. Incredible. So Tashma, Kever Chadash Moter Ba'ana, a brand new grave is Moter Ba'ana. So we'll say again, what's the din of a Kever Chadash? Kever Chadash is just a grave that was dug. Right? Just stam dug. So the Gemara says, Moter Ba'ana, Hitel Bo Nefel, Asr Ba'ana. If you bury a stillborn in there, a baby in there, then it becomes Asr Ba'ana. So we'll say, by the way, the reason we use Lashon of Nefel is because often a nefel is a nondescript mace, right? This could be a miscarriage. This could be a stillborn baby. So in other words, there's not an identity for the mace. So therefore, again, even if you go ahead, it's almost as like, say even if you just buried a nefel in there, ultimately it's Asr Ba'ana. Hittel in, lo hittel. So what do you see from here? It's only once you bury the nefel in the grave that the grave becomes Asr Ba'ana. So what do you see from here? Only once it's actively used. Designation is not enough to make it Asr. To which the Gemara says, not true. The truth is, even if you didn't put anything in the grave, it's still Asr. This comes to us with a position of Rabbi Shimon Silber says that in general, a stillborn or a miscarriage does not go ahead and endow the area with the status of a grave. So it's coming to exclude that position. What's the case over here? I'm sorry, just skip Tashma. Moshe HaMesim L'Mesim, Moshe HaMesim L'Yasha. So we'll say, remember, all of this is still Machlokes Abai and Rava, Hazmana Milsa, Hazmana Lav Milsa. So the interesting case over here. Let's say, Yaakov passed away, and we go ahead and we collect money for Yaakov's burial expenses. And it turns out that there's surplus funds. What do you do with surplus funds? So the Gemara says, Moshe HaMesim L'Mesim, okay, whatever is surplus stays in what we'll call the burial fund. Burial funds, all right, you don't need it for Yaakov, you'll use it for future Levayas. Moshe HaMeis Liyarshav. So actually, let me reframe this. If in general there's a general collection, right? We're collecting for the needs of the dead, right? Somebody passed away, a nondescript collection, and there's surplus, so that remains in the we'll call it the burial fund. What happens if, let's say, we're collecting for someone specific? We're collecting for Yaakov. Yaakov passed away, collecting for Yaakov's Levai. Now it turns out, again, we needed $5,000, we raised $7,000. What do we do with the extra $2,000? The Gemara says it goes to the Yarshim, goes to the children. Goes to children. So we'll say, so now, interestingly enough, how come I ask, what's the case over here? Shagava mechayim. Now we'll say, now, what's interesting about this is as follows. If you take a look at Rashi says this is in the wide lines of Rashi, 3 lines down the Yarshav. Lehanos mehem. The Yarshim get the surplus money to benefit from it. Alma hazmana lav milsi. So we'll say, what do you see from here? So that money was designated for Yaakov's burial expenses. But now that there's surplus, what do you do with the surplus money? It goes to the kids. What do you see from here? That has mana lav milsa. The designation does not endow something with identity. To which Meir says, no, we collected this while Reuven is alive. That's a little awkward, right? But Lamaisa, again, Reuven was imminently dying. They knew that the family didn't have the money to cover the expenses. They wanted to be proactive, so they collected it while he was alive. Now, the difference between that is, okay, now you're collecting money for burial expenses of someone who's still alive, so therefore, again, it's not called money associated with the dead, and therefore, Allah Lamaisa, it should be mutter. So Gemara says, halo taniach. That's not what it says. Disnan, mosra hamesim lamesim, mosra hames liyarshav. Leftover money that was collected for the general dead remains in the burial fund. Mosra hames, but any money is left over for the dead, in other words, collected for a specific person who died, go to the kids. For Tani Allah, for the Gemara says, what's the example? First one, I'm say, Ketzad gaval lamesim stam, zem mosra hamesim lamesim. What was the case? So case number 1 is, in general, we're collecting for general burial needs, not someone specific, general needs. That goes into the general burial fund. The mace zeu mosra mace liyarshab. When we're collecting for Reuven or for Yaakov, right? That's specific funds for a specific mace. Surplus funds go to the kids. So we'll say that sounds like we're collecting the money once Yaakov's already dead. So this is fascinating. So we'll say it turns out that this is actually a raging machlokes. So we'll say, listen to this case, right? So Yaakov dies. So again, if we're raising general funds for burial expenses, again, I know that I need to raise funds for Yaakov who died. But the way we frame the collection is, this is for the needs of the dead. So it's a general collection. Okay, so that's easy. Any surplus funds remain in the burial fund. But now, let's say Yaakov died. Yaakov's Zavai is going to cost $5,000. We need to go ahead and raise $5,000. We end up raising 7. So what do you do with the extra $2,000? So the Tanakama says it goes to Yaakov's Yarshim. Listen to this. Rabbi Meir Omer, lo yiga bahen at shiyava Eyal. Rabbi Meir says, don't touch it. Don't touch it. It's not clear. Essentially, it's not clear what we do with that money. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, we leave it until Eliyahu Hanavi comes. Rabbi Nassan says, Ya'asenu dimos al kivro. No, use the extra funds for Reuven's matzeva. Use it for his matzeva or a structure. Use it for something associated with his grave. Or sprinkle wine or something aromatic on his funeral beer. In other words, Rabbi Nassan says the money has to be used for Yaakov himself, Reuven, whoever we're using. It has to be used for the deceased. So what says? Now watch this. The Gemara says, Both Abaye and Rava interpret this brisa in accordance with their respective positions. Here we go. Abaye says everyone agrees that designation endows the item with identity. So Tanakama savar dechazile tafis to lo chazile lo tafis. So therefore, but Abaye says like this. Tanakama says like this. You're right. Hazmana milsi, but hazmana only goes like this. Only the money that is going to be necessary for the burial of Reuven is endowed with burial money identity. The rest of the money is not. And therefore, Allah Chalamaysa goes to the Yarshim. That's the Tanakama. Meir misafkile, itafis, ilo tafis. Meir is not sure. Meir is not sure. Does the Hazmana devolve upon all the money collected or only the money necessary for the burial? Therefore, hilchach lo yiga bahen at shiava ilio. Therefore, again, Rabbi Meir says, don't touch the remainder until Eyal Navi comes. Rabbi Nassan, pshitale devadai tafis, hilchach yasena dimos akivo. Rabbi Nassan says, no, it's obvious, hazmana milsi, and therefore, again, the burial identity devolves upon all of the money, and therefore, Allah Chalamaysa, all of it must be used for the needs of the burial. And if you don't need it for the burial, use it for aromatic sprinkling on the funeral beer, a matzeva, so on and so forth. Rav interprets this according to his reasoning. The Chuli Amma has Manalam Milsi. Everyone, remember, this is Rava. According to Rava, everyone agrees that designation does not endow with identity. Tanakama Savar Kibazu Le Achuli Machal Zilus Achuli Machal. So Tanakama says like this. In general, the collection of money for one's burial needs is embarrassing. It's embarrassing that a person can't take care of it for themselves. But nevertheless, so the Gemara says, "Achulim machol zuluse gabi yarshin." But nevertheless, again, the mace is mochel for the yarshin. He doesn't want the yarshin to have to be saddled with anything, and therefore he's mochel, and therefore halacha l'maisa the remainder goes to the yarshin. If Rabbi Meir misafkile imachil ilo mochel, Rabbi Meir is not sure whether or not the mace is mochel or not. Therefore hilchach lo yiga bahen. Therefore, don't touch the remainder of the money. Rabbi Nasan pshitale delo mochel. Rabbi Meir says ultimately again the mace is not mochel. Therefore, again yaseh dimos al kivro. Ultimately, again, make it a demos, use it for burial needs or a matzeva. Oh, zilo f'lemitaso. So, okay, fine. So, we'll say, so halacha l'maisa, again, the point over here is that halacha l'maisa, the machlokes Abaye and Rava ultimately still remains in existence. Good. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, fine. So, by the mechila over here is that whether or not a person ultimately, again, is mochel on the fact that he's going to suffer humiliation after his death. In other words, the idea over here is he's mochel on that day. That's what Rashi says over here. Tana Kamasov, if you look 3 lines from the bottom, mechayim achle leziluse. When he was alive, he was already mochel ultimately, again, on his embarrassment. V'nechale sheis bazer la'achar misaso. He's mochel that he'll be embarrassed after his death, lahanoas yarshim, for the benefit of his children. Okay? So both say, bottom line is, both Abaye and Rava both interpreting the machlokes in alignment with their own respective positions. Tashma, haya avivi, mamazarkim bokelim. So listen to this, what I say. Let's say parents lose a child. Right? Parents, Reuven and Rachel lose their child. And what happens? They are so distressed that they're taking all of their items, literally again, their garments, and they're throwing it on. It sounds like what they're doing is they're throwing it on top of the grave of their son, right? As almost like Rashi points out over here, as like a display of nothing in life is meaningful anymore now that we lost our child. Now the problem over here is when they throw everything on the kever, does that become aser ba'ana and create a significant issue going forward? So haya avivi imam mizarkin bokelim mitzava alacherim lahatzilan. We tell other people to quickly go and save the garments. In other words, look at Rashi. Mitzava alacherim last Rashi daf haroin osam lahatzilan v'litlan me'alav dena shavas haveda godol mizeh ama azman la milsehi di milsehi leka hatzala. So we'll say, what we say to other people is quick. As the parents are throwing that, pick it up, take the garments. Now we'll say, now what do you see from this? The fact that the others could go ahead and step in and pick up the garments indicates to us, Hazmana lav milsehi, that designation is not significant. Because if designation was significant, then halacha l'maisa, it would be too late. We'll say, Amud Beis, Hasam mishum merarayhu. It's different over there. That case is different. Why is that case different? Because halacha l'maisa, it's clear the parents aren't making an informed decision. What's happening over here? They're so consumed by grief that they're just throwing away all of their stuff. So there's a lack of das. So this is not a din in hazmana milsa, hazmana lav milsa. There's no das over. So because there's no das, therefore halacha l'maisa, others could step in and save the item. Ihachi. When is this so? So also listen to this. When is that so that you could save it? When the items being thrown have not touched the mita. Now we're assuming over here, which literally means the burial bed. Aval nogu b'mita asurin. But again, I will say, so b'pashtos, what this sounds like is, as long as it didn't touch the funeral beer. But if it touched the funeral beer, it's asur ba'ana. But I don't understand. If there's not really like informed das over here, so why should it make a difference? Tergama ula b'mita hanik beres imo. No. When we say if it touches the bed, it's not talking about the funeral beer. I will say, essentially, there were like 2 different mitos. There was one mita in which the mace was carried, right? But then there was another mita with which the mace was buried. So when the parents are originally throwing garments, they're throwing it on the mita, on the bier on which the deceased is being carried. So that, again, other people could come, rescue the items, save the items, because again, no one's going ahead and making any informed choices over here. This is grief. And they could salvage the items. If on the other hand, items are thrown on the bier, on the bed, or on the structure, we'll call it the bier, that the son is going to be buried with. Once stuff has been thrown on there, you can't take it off. Why not? Because anything thrown on the bier in which the mace is going to be buried almost could be confused with tachrichim, with burial shrouds. And we're concerned that if people start taking stuff off that bed, then what people will think that burial shrouds can be repurposed as well. Okay, Tashma. Gemara says, Tashma, kiss. And we'll say back to our tefillin case. If you have a pouch that was made for tefillin, a tefillin bag, asur anicha bamos. So ultimately, you can't use it for a money pouch. Hiniach bo tefillin. So Gemara says, I'm sorry. Kish asur aniach bo tefillin, asur aniach bo bamos. So what says interesting? So Rabbi says, if you have a bag that was made for tefillin, you cannot use it for money. Hiniach bo tefillin. If you only placed tefillin in it, which makes it sound like the pouch was not made for tefillin, but rather again it was a pouch. You happen to put tefillin in it, then what? Yaniach ba ma'os. Ultimately, again, you could put money in it. So I say, interestingly enough, this certainly sounds like hazmana milsa. Certainly sounds like designation. Ultimately, again, is significant. To which the Gemara says, Ema asa'o v'hiniach bo tefillin, asar lahaniach bo ma'os, kid Rav Chista. So I say, no, rather read it as follows. If you made the pouch for tefillin and you used it for tefillin, then you can't subsequently use it for money. Whose opinion does that reflect? That's Rav Chista. But remember again, what did Rav Chista say in Amud Aleph? What did Rav Chista say? You need designation and usage in order to go ahead and endow an item with identity. So Tashma, Amar the Uman, Aseli Tikshal Sefer, or not Tikshal Tefillin. I go over to the craftsman, I say the craftsman, make me a cover, right, or literally a box for a Sefer Torah, or nartik shatol, or make me a tefillin bag. What's the halacha? Achlo nishtamish bahen kodesh, so kodesh mutter lashtamish bahen chol. So I'll say if I have not yet used the items in their consecrated purpose, then ultimately I can use it for whatever I want. Right? However, nishtamish bahen kodesh, ashlo nishtamish bahen chol. But if once I used it for a consecrated purpose, I can no longer use it for something mundane. So we'll say, what does that sound like? What does that sound like? That sounds like Rava, that hazmana lav milsihi. Designation is not significant. In other words, even though it's been designated, so long as it has not been used, ultimately it does not have identity. Tush Gemara says, in reality, Tanaihi. This whole thing is a machlokes tanoim. Hazmana milsi, hazmana lav milsi is a machlokes tanoim. Disanya, here we go. Tzipan zav, oshetal alein, or behemoth mea. So is a tefillin. If you decided to coat your tefillin in gold, which sounds beautiful, right? But you're not allowed to do it, right? Or for that matter, again, you used hide of a non-kosher animal. Besuros. Ultimately, again, the tefillin are pasul. So, our behemoth toros, ksheros. But if you use the leather, right, you use leather from a kosher animal, obviously the tefillin are kosher. Afal pishlo ibdan lishman. That's interesting. Even though the hides that were used for tefillin were not tanned lishma. Right? Even though the tanning wasn't done lishma. Rabbi Shmuel says, af or behema tahora psulos ad she'ibdan lishma. So Rabbi Shmuel says, no. It's not enough to use a kosher hide, but rather you also have to have a hide that was tanned for the purposes of tefillin. So fine. So the point over here is, once again, this is same machlokes. The Gemara is suggesting that this machlokes, whether or not you need tanning lishma, ultimately, again, is the machlokes Abaye and Rava, as is hazmana milsi or lav milsi. Okay. Rashi says over here, Afagav Shalo Abdullah Arzel Shmo, Dazmana Lav Milsi Velo Ichbas Lan Ba. Same machlokes. So we'll say all the Gemara just did over here, Abaye and Rava took that machlokes and made it into a machlokes Tanoim. Okay. Another Rava. Savini said to Rava, so Rava, the following, Mi iko duchta duramu be'meis va'argi beged lemeis. So we'll say, by the way, now, after this whole thing, the Gemara just brings up such an interesting question. Remember how this whole machlokes Abaye and Rava got started? How did it get started? The lashon of the Gemara was, ha'oreg beged lemeis. If one weaves a beged for a mace. That's how this whole thing got started. So we'll say, so now the Gemara just asks, well, what does that mean, ha'oreg beged lemeis? So is there such a thing, ultimately, again, that one is weaving a beged for the mace? What? The mace is going to sit there, is just going to lie there while you're weaving the beged? It takes time to weave a beged. Or so what's the pshat with weaving a beged for the mace? To which the Gemara says, no, it happens. It happened, Harpanya was a very poor community, and there literally, again, even for Tachrichim, what would happen is someone would die, and halacha l'maisa, after they would die, they would kind of scrounge together, scraps, and make Tachrichim for the dead. Okay, Darsh Meimar. So we'll say, Darsh Meimar, Hilchasa Kavase Da'abaye. So we'll say fundamental machlokes over here. Who does the halacha follow, Abaye or Rava? So again, first opinion says the halacha follows Abaye, Hazman and Milsa. Second opinion said the halacha follows Rava, so Hazman and Lav Milsa. And both say v'hilchasa kavase de Rava. The halacha follows Rava, that Hazmana Lav Milsahi. That ultimately again halacha l'maisa, designation does not endow an item with identity. Now I will say the truth is, generally, that's how we paskin. So I'll just give you an example. For example, let's say a person buys a brand new tefillin bag. I bought a brand new tefillin bag, right? It says tefillin on it, right? It has my name on it. So pretty much, it looks like a tefillin bag, smells like a tefillin bag. Interestingly enough, technically speaking, if you decide to repurpose that as a lunch bag, right? It's one fancy lunch bag, right? Technically, you could do it. The Mishnah brings down, you could do that. Why? Because Hazman Alav Milsi. All there's been a designation. Now, once you put your tefillin in there, then it's used. Once it's used for tefillin, then you can't make it into a lunch bag. But technically speaking, you pass it like Rava, Hazman Alav Milsi. Now that's by the tefillin bag. Other cases in halacha may not be as clear, but the Gemara is ruling over here like Rava, Hazmana Lav Milsa. Designation of something for a particular purpose does not endow it with identity. I will say there's a tremendous Musar Haskell in that as well. What does it mean? What's the Musar of Hazmana Lav Milsi? So I will say, what is designation? Designation is a thought. Thoughts do not create reality. Intentions do not create reality. What creates reality? Actions. So when you put your tefillin in a tefillin bag, there's a maisa. Maisim create reality. Thoughts and intentions not. And I both say, such a tremendous musar in life. We go through life with so many beautiful thoughts, so many intentions, goals, dreams, aspirations, which are all fundamentally beautiful and incredible, but are meaningless unless we act. Hazmana Lav Milsi. Intentions, designations do not create realities. Only actions do. That is true. Halacha l'maisa and hashkafa l'maisa. Zabosai shkoyach. All right, everyone, Zoom. Have a great day, everyone. Shkoyach.
As far as mitzvahs to do, it has to be.
Why?
It's a secret Shabbat.
No, we pass the mitzvahs in the Shuvas Kavanah. If mitzvahs required Kavanah, we'd be in really big trouble.
You don't need Kavanah to make mitzvahs. You don't need Kavanah to make mitzvahs.
Certain things require Kavanah, but generally, you put on tefillin in the morning. You need Kavanah when you put it on. Of
course.
No, you don't. Do that.
You don't have to think when you make that bracha on that foot that I'm connecting to Mevorach. That's.
You just have to have Kavanah that you're putting on tefillin.
You mean some guy in the street that doesn't know what you're saying? So
Correct. If you need that level of Kavanah, nobody would be able to.